Nevada sky was no longer the desert's familiar harsh blue. Instead, it had turned an angry, deep purple-black. It was torn open by lightning bolts stretching across the Las Vegas Strip. The wind was no longer blowing. It was roaring at jet aircraft speed, crushing rows of palm trees and flinging cars aside. Sirens were swallowed whole, drowned out completely by nature's scream. High-voltage power lines exploded, shooting eerie blue sparks before the entire American West sank into endless darkness down in the valley. Hoover Dam was trembling to its very foundations. Reinforced concrete that was once believed it could last for millennia was now crumbling under the pressure of billions of cubic meters of water. Massive cracks crawled across the dam's surface, spitting out ultra-high-pressure jets that ripped through the air. A wall of water hundreds of meters tall stood poised to swallow all life downstream. Homes, bridges, roads, and even humanity's last hopes. All of it became meaningless in the face of this fury. This isn't some far-fetched hypothesis. This is the scenario of a day when nature decides to take back what belongs to it. When a Category 6 superstorm combines with the collapse of a megastructure, a modern empire will vanish into thin air in just a few short minutes. The moment Hoover Dam shatters is the moment the world's maps are redrawn with mud and shattered concrete. The clock struck 11 p.m. A thick, heavy darkness smothered Black Canyon, where the fragile boundary between Nevada and Arizona was erased by torrential rains and flash floods. The once gentle Colorado River had become a raging monster of red-brown mud roaring through the narrow gorge. Above it stood Hoover Dam, a reinforced concrete marvel weighing over 6 million tons. Towering there, struggling to hold back the ocean trapped behind it, the rain didn't fall in drops. It poured down in unbroken walls of water, wiping out visibility and turning any attempt to observe with the naked eye into a lost cause. The floodlights from the control center were reduced to faint specks, flickering against the overwhelming power of nature. This anomaly didn't begin tonight. It had started 72 hours earlier, deep in the Pacific Ocean. A massive tropical low-pressure system had merged with the phenomenon of an extreme atmospheric river, forming a moisture plume thousands of miles long, aimed straight at the American Southwest. The moisture it carried was equivalent to the combined flow of 10 Mississippi rivers, crashing down onto land already parched and rendered nearly impermeable after years of Category 6 drought. The desert ground, hard as stone, had now become a massive slide for floodwaters. Thousands of flash floods erupted simultaneously across upstream tributaries, all funneling toward a single point. Lake Mead. The water level at Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir in the United States, was rising at an unimaginable rate. The gauge needle surged past 1,220 feet, then 1,225 feet, quickly hitting the red alert line at 1,229 feet. In control rooms deep beneath the dam, seismic sensors began to spike wildly. The hydrostatic pressure on the dam's upstream face had exceeded every design specification from the 1,930 seconds. No matter how durable it is, concrete has its limits. Every additional cubic meter of rising water meant millions of tons of added pressure, crushing the dam's arch structure against the two limestone cliffs of Black Canyon. The spillway gates were opened at full capacity. Water blasted out of the massive tunnels at wind-tearing speed, forming white, frothing plumes over 30 feet high. But then an engineering catastrophe struck. Upstream flash floods had swept along tens of thousands of ancient tree trunks, the remains of houses, and millions of tons of mud and debris. The wreckage began clogging the trash racks and jamming the regulating valves. The scream of twisted metal echoed through the dark tunnels as the flow was choked off. With no way out, the water pressure began to surge back, creating hydraulic shocks as powerful as time bomb explosions inside the dam. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the immense pressure forced its way into hairline cracks in the limestone bed beneath the reservoir, reducing friction along hidden underground faults. A magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck directly beneath Hoover Dam. The ground convulsed violently. Inside the service tunnels, workers and engineers only had time to hear a single crack booming like thunder from deep underground. It wasn't rock splitting. It was hundreds of feet of concrete being ripped apart. The first fracture appeared on the upstream face, starting at the base and racing upward like a black bolt of lightning. Water began blasting out on the downstream face with pressure high enough to slice steel plate. At first, the jets were thin and ghostly, but they quickly became violent torrents, stripping away protective paint and starting to gouge into the concrete core. The arch structure began to lose its symmetrical stability. The national warning system blared across every radio frequency, but that sound was insignificant next to the roar of a dam coming apart. In small towns downstream, people slept on, unaware. Inside Hoover Dam's control room, engineers watched in horror as the pressure graphs plunged straight down. Their compass needle now pointed to nothing but despair. On the dam's surface, the roadway linking Nevada and Arizona began to ripple like a ribbon under structural distortion. Streetlights collapsed and power cables snapped, throwing brilliant electrical arcs into the pitch-black rain. The light from those short circuits illuminated a horrific sight. A massive Y-shaped crack had spread all the way to the dam's crest. Pressure from Lake Mead was no longer contained. It began driving the entire central section of the dam forward. Concrete blocks weighing thousands of tons started separating, exposing the rebar skeleton still stubbornly holding on. The hiss of compressed air and the thunder of floodwater fused into a demonic symphony. Every mechanical system, every human effort over nearly a century was now nothing but meaningless debris before the primal power of water. In the final instant of the beginning, as the dam tilted into a deadly angle, a strange silence flickered for a heartbeat. And then an explosion more violent than any thunder ever recorded detonated, shaking the entire Nevada mountain range. The greatest dam in the world officially collapsed. Billions of cubic meters of water stored over decades began surging through the Liaphone, forming a savage leading wave as tall as a 60-story building, hurtling into the darkness of Black Canyon. The beginning of the catastrophe was over, making way for a geographic and humanitarian massacre unlike anything in human history. All that remained was total destruction. It was racing forward at extreme speed, heading straight for the heart of the American West. The final concrete barrier collapsed. A supersonic blast shook the entire crust of the Earth across the region. It generated a shockwave that tore the curtain of rain apart. Billions of cubic meters of water from Lake Mead were now unleashed with immeasurable force. A colossal mass of water over 650 feet high, taller than even the greatest skyscrapers ever built, hurtled into the narrow throat of Black Canyon. This was no longer a normal flow. It was a land-based tsunami, moving at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Black Canyon, narrow and steep, inadvertently became a massive gun barrel, choking the water and driving the pressure to extreme levels. The flow was a thick, pitch-black mixture of mud, boulders, and millions of tons of reinforced concrete debris from the shattered dam. Concrete blocks weighing hundreds of tons now were nothing more than stray bullets carried by the torrent, pulverizing everything in their path. Downstream, the towns of Laughlin and Bullhead City had not even a second to react. In less than 5 minutes after the dam failed, the entire area was completely erased. Homes, high-rise hotels, and glittering casinos were lifted from their foundations by the flood, shattering like paper models. Everything was crushed inside a gigantic meat grinder of water, mud, and stone. The deluge continued its march of destruction southward, heading straight for Davis Dam, utterly helpless before a wall of water 3 times its own height. When the wave struck, Davis Dam was flattened in an instant. Its collapse added millions more cubic meters of water to the army of destruction. Parker Dam, farther downstream, met the same fate. America's inland water defense system collapsed like a sandcastle. Erosion occurred on a scale never before witnessed. The extremely low pressure created by the high-speed flow tore apart the geological layers of the Colorado riverbed. The riverbed was scoured more than 30 feet deeper in just minutes, sweeping away entire ecosystems and man-made structures alike. Massive steel bridges spanning the river were twisted like ropes before vanishing into the raging torrent. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, the disaster took on a different form. When the power units at Hoover Dam were destroyed, the entire city plunged into profound darkness. The brilliant neon signs went dead. Air conditioning systems shut down amid the suffocating desert heat. An eerie silence fell over streets that were never meant to sleep. But darkness was only the beginning. The water supply system for Las Vegas and Southern California depended entirely on Lake Mead's water level and automated electric pumping stations. Now the reservoir was gone, and the pumping stations had been destroyed. The sole lifeline of 40 million people in the American Southwest had been severed. In high-rise buildings, fire suppression systems were disabled. Elevators ground to a halt, trapping thousands of people inside dark steel boxes. Panic began to spread as people realized the civilization they had trusted for so long had collapsed in a single night. The scenes in the downstream cities were hell on earth. The floodwaters didn't recede right away. They turned into a vast sea of mud, swallowing everything. Faint cries kept rising from the rubble, but no one came to help. Communications were completely paralyzed. Cell towers were knocked down, and fiber optic lines were torn apart. Those who survived the first wave now faced a brutal reality. They were utterly isolated in a salty mud desert. No clean water, no food, and no help of any kind from the outside world. On a broader scale, this disaster triggered a geological shift. The Colorado River carved out a new course, spilling into low valleys and threatening to permanently drown the Imperial Valley. Millions of acres of farmland, the primary source of produce for all of North America, were now buried under salt-contaminated mud and toxic chemicals from destroyed industrial zones along the riverbanks. Humanity's struggle to survive became more desperate than ever. Rescue units tried to reach the disaster zone by helicopter, but the storm winds were still howling and visibility was near zero, turning every attempt into a suicide mission. Helicopters were slammed down by the extreme wind. On the ground, major highways were severed. Large cities like Phoenix, Los Angeles, and San Diego began to descend into chaos as residents rushed to stockpile essentials, sparking massive riots in the darkness. All the most advanced technology, all early warning systems, became useless once the critical threshold was crossed. Hoover Dam was now nothing but a colossal geological scar, proof of reinforced concrete's bitter failure. The land tsunami kept charging onward, an empire collapsing not because of war, but because of a crack in the concrete crown it built for itself, under the hands of a nature that had run out of patience. As the night slowly passed, the only remaining light came from wildfires and ruptured gas pipelines exploding. In the flickering light of destruction, people saw a scene so bleak it was chilling. A vast expanse, thousands of square kilometers, had turned into a sprawling wreckage field where the line between life and death was as thin as a hair. That colossal mass of water still hadn't stopped. It was pushing steadily toward the Gulf of California, carrying with it the shattered remains of a once glorious civilization, leaving behind a void nothing could ever fill. That was the price of human arrogance. When the next day's sun tried to pierce the gray haze, it no longer shone on a promised land, but on a vast mud graveyard, stretching for hundreds of miles along the Colorado River basin. The deluge had passed, but what it left behind was a geological and humanitarian scar that could never heal. Preliminary estimates put the death toll at over 250,000 killed or missing in the first 12 hours alone. In cities like Laughlin, Bullhead, and Needles, the survival rate was virtually zero. The floodwaters didn't just sweep people away, they crushed them beneath millions of tons of concrete fragments, vehicles, and boulders. The remains of those great structures now mixed with salty mud, forming a deadly layer of sediment that blanketed the entire downstream region. But the true tragedy lay with the 40 million survivors who now faced a future without clean water and energy. Hoover Dam was not just a concrete wall. It was the heartbeat of the American Southwest. When that heart stopped, a systemic stroke began to spread. The entire Western power grid officially collapsed, from data centers in Silicon Valley to hospitals in Los Angeles. Everything was plunged into paralysis. 2,000 megawatts of clean power vanished in an instant, pushing millions into a prehistoric existence in the heart of a modern nation. Without electricity, water pumping stations shut down. Cooling systems at nuclear power plants began to overload, threatening cascading failures across multiple states. To the south, an agricultural catastrophe was forming on a global scale. The Imperial Valley had turned into a salt marsh. Floodwaters from the Colorado River carried massive amounts of salt-laced sediment and toxic chemicals, seeping deep into the cultivated soil. Millions of acres of farmland were rendered completely unusable. The global food supply chain snapped instantly. World food prices hit record highs within 24 hours. Hunger began knocking on the door of every household in America's major cities. The U.S. economy, the engine of the world, entered free fall. California's GDP was projected to drop by 20%. Technology, aviation, and manufacturing giants declared force majeure in unison. Economic losses were estimated in the trillions of dollars, a figure large enough to sink any nation and trigger a Great Depression lasting for decades. The federal government's response was an act of desperation. The U.S. president declared martial law across 7 western states. The National Guard and the military were mobilized at maximum capacity to contain the wave of riots and looting that was erupting. Ghost cities like Las Vegas became battlefields as gangs fought over every last cup of clean water. FEMA and the Red Cross set up massive refugee camps. But resources quickly ran dry in the face of millions of displaced people. This was the largest migration in U.S. history since the Civil War, as people fled regions no longer capable of sustaining life. In an unprecedented twist, the United States, once a leader in international disaster relief, now became a recipient of aid. Trains carrying clean water and essential supplies from the European Union, and Japan began heading toward West Coast ports. It was a brutal blow to America's great power status. While Washington struggled to contain the disaster, a massive power vacuum emerged. The world's geopolitical axes began to shift as other nations exploited America's weakness to reshape order in strategic regions. The collapse of Hoover Dam was not merely an engineering failure. It was the starting point of a societal breakdown. Geology experts warned that rebuilding was nearly impossible because Black Canyon's underlying strata had been severely deformed. The Colorado River would never be tamed again. Once dazzling cities now faced a slow-motion sentence. An era of abundance had ended, giving way to a brutal fight for survival for every last basic resource. Nature was no longer merely warning. It had snapped the backbone of a civilization that believed it could dominate every law of existence. The final period of a glorious era was written in mud and darkness, leaving a shattered America forced to learn how to survive. A new world order was forming from the ruins where humans were only fragile guests before an earth burning with rage. As the roar of the flood faded into nothingness, silence fell over Black Canyon with a chilling tone. Hoover Dam, the wonder of the 20th century, was now reduced to 2 lonely blocks of concrete, torn apart like the dry bones of a fallen giant. The map of the American West had been completely redrawn. Cities that once glittered were now ghost towns, sunk into darkness and despair. The collapse of Hoover Dam was not merely a technical disaster. It was the opening shot of a global power shift, as the world's #1 superpower was forced to retreat inward to grapple with its internal wounds. The global political order spiraled into a new vortex of instability, filled with risks and calculations. What remained was an expensive warning about the fragility of megastructures in the face of an increasingly extreme, changing climate. We mistook ourselves for capable of shackling nature with artificial walls and forgot that humanity's time is only a blink compared to the Earth's patience. As humans continue to batter the climate and geological systems, nature will not warn us with words. It will answer with rages that cannot be restrained. The ruins in Black Canyon will stand forever as a monument to human arrogance, a reminder that in the war with nature, humanity was never the final victor.